MotoGP in 2025 is no longer a championship. It is a battlefield of philosophies, a crucible where engines are not just machines but manifestos written in steel, fuel, and tire rubber. Ducati's Scarlet Empire stands like a cathedral of speed, its Desmosedici roaring with inevitability, while Honda claws back fragments of lost glory and KTM gambles on the raw lightning of Pedro Acosta. Yet amid this storm of reinvention, Yamaha lingers at a crossroads where memory collides with necessity. For 2 decades, their inline 4M1 was the brushstroke of genius, the violin of MotoGP, carrying Rossi, Lorenzo, and Quartararo into immortality. But Michelin's arrival shattered the rhythm, demanding violence over elegance, rear grip exploitation over flowing lines. The result was cruel. Yamaha's masterpiece became a relic, punished by a new order it refused to join. Now the V4 has emerged from the shadows, fragile yet inevitable, a newborn bird flapping against hawks, its first laps whispering both promise and peril. Quartararo, their lone star, lives the paradox with every throttle twist, his talent dragging a past philosophy beyond its grave, his patience fraying under the weight of promises too long deferred. Engineers pore over telemetry like priests reading scripture, chasing half a second that separates relevance from ruin. Rossi's unexpected return to Yamaha's box at Misano blurred nostalgia and irony, his presence a blessing wrapped in betrayal. Riders are divided, optimism colliding with skepticism, unity breaking where faith is needed most. And so the story sharpens into a single question. Can Yamaha shed its sacred skin to embrace the brutality of the present, or will it drown in reverence for the ghost of what once was? This is not just about horsepower or aerodynamics. It is about identity, survival, and the soul of racing itself. In the next breath, in the next test, in the next half second, lies the verdict of an empire trembling between yesterday's legends and tomorrow's truth. And at the center of this shifting universe, where philosophies collide and futures are forged, Ducati continues to reign supreme, its dominance casting a shadow so vast that every rival must measure themselves against its red horizon. Ducati stands at the summit, their Desmosedici machines slicing through air with a velocity that feels almost cruel, and every weekend they reinforce the impression that red has become the inevitable color of supremacy. Márquez, no longer just a rider, but an architect of chaos, bends races into his will, chasing destiny as if rewriting the scriptures of speed, while Honda stitches its broken empire with patience that borders on stubborn ritual. KTM, unpredictable and fierce, is entrusting its hopes to the mercurial brilliance of Pedro Acosta, a rider whose genius flickers like lightning over restless seas, beautiful and destructive at once. In this theater of mechanical poetry, Yamaha appears like an actor fumbling with a fading script, forced to confront its deepest fear, irrelevance. The paddock whispers carry the scent of inevitability, because MotoGP today is not about legends of yesterday, but about those who dare to master tomorrow's science of grip, torque, and telemetry. Every race feels like walking into a cathedral where Ducati writes the hymns, confessed one engineer, his words heavy with awe and resignation. Quartararo, staring at the screen in the quiet of his motorhome, thinks, if they've turned the future into red, what color is left for me? This inner murmur lingers, almost more painful than the cold data flashing on dashboards that never lie. What often escapes headlines is a detail tucked inside Ducati's relentless rise. The use of advanced pneumatic valve springs, subtly tuned to resist thermal drift over 20 laps, ensuring consistency where others fade. It's not only horsepower but persistence, not only aggression but a patient kind of precision. Ducati rides like an unbroken river, carving valleys where others drown. The contrast with Yamaha's hesitation becomes unbearable, and the silence in their garage feels like a museum where echoes of Rossi and Lorenzo hang like old portraits. Every sound in the pit lane carries double weight. The clap of a wheel gun, the rasp of a warm-up lap, the sharp crack of exhausts tearing through night rehearsals. Ducati's dominance is not just speed but an atmosphere, a pressure dome suffocating the dreams of every rival. One senses it in the body language of mechanics, who no longer look sideways but straight ahead, as if fate is predictable. Honda's rebuild remains fragile scaffolding. KTM's spark is dazzling yet inconsistent. Aprilia hovers, promising but unfinished. And Yamaha, yes Yamaha, finds itself trapped between nostalgia and necessity, still admired but slowly excluded from the table where tomorrow is negotiated. The sport's tempo has changed. Each lap now a declaration of technological philosophy, each straight a courtroom where engines plead their truth. To watch Ducati is to witness inevitability sculpted in carbon fiber and steel, a dominance that burns bright without mercy. Yet in the shadow of that brilliance grows the silence of those preparing for revolution, and silence in racing can be louder than victory. When Márquez leans his body into corners that defy geometry, he's not just chasing rivals but memory itself. The paddock feels it. We are living inside an era where Ducati's crown is unquestionable. And yet, hidden in Yamaha's doubts, there trembles a secret question that rattles the heart of MotoGP. If red is eternal today, who dares to paint the future another shade? For 2 decades, the Yamaha M1 Inline 4 was not simply an engine but a hymn of smoothness, a song of control that allowed Rossi to sculpt victories, Lorenzo to trace perfection, and Quartararo to defy physics on circuits that swallowed others whole. That architecture, long celebrated for its balance and predictability, turned Yamaha into the guardian of tradition, even as the rest of MotoGP evolved toward sharper teeth and fiercer claws. We were the last to hold the flame, one senior engineer admitted quietly, his voice breaking with the weight of heritage. Quartararo, sitting in his leathers before Misano's humid dawn, wonders, what if I've been fighting not just rivals, but the ghost of a philosophy too stubborn to change? The thought clings like smoke, bitter and suffocating. Technically, the Inline-4's greatest flaw under modern regulations lay in its crankshaft inertia, slower to respond in stop-and-go dynamics compared to the compact explosiveness of AV4. Each acceleration zone became a courtroom where Yamaha's past was cross-examined and found guilty by milliseconds. Watching Ducati, Honda, KTM, and Aprilia carve through straights with V4 engines that inhaled air like storms, Yamaha seemed to linger in yesterday's weather. The metaphor was cruel but precise. The Inline-4 was a noble violin, delicate and pure, trying to compete in an arena suddenly dominated by electric guitars and thunderous amplifiers. When Suzuki bowed out in 2022, it left Yamaha as the final custodian of this elegance, a solitary figure in a desert of change. The romanticism of being the last defender soon curdled into ridicule, as every data sheet showed glaring deficits in top speed and acceleration. Inside the garage, engineers wrestled with contradictory emotions, pride in a design that defined eras, and despair in watching it unravel under the tyranny of lap times. The tension reached a climax in 2024, when results showed loyalty to tradition was not just nostalgic but ruinous. Yamaha's M1 had become a museum piece still asked to duel against predators. Journalists framed it as the end of an era, but to those living it, the sensation was more intimate. It felt like watching a trusted companion aging in front of you, still graceful but fatally slow. Lorenzo once described the Inline-4 as a brush that paints every corner. Yet in the new era, brushes broke under the heavy canvas of Michelin tires demanding brutal strokes. The change was no longer optional. It was survival disguised as betrayal. Riders sensed it, mechanics whispered it, fans debated it, but Yamaha's decision was inevitable. And when the official word came, the paddock exhaled in unison. The Inline-4 was history. When Bridgestone left the stage in 2016, it was not merely a supplier changing hands but an earthquake that redrew the tectonic plates of MotoGP. The Bridgestone front tire had been a loyal accomplice to Yamaha's Inline-4 symphony, letting riders lean with balletic grace and carve lines that seemed painted by invisible brushes. Michelin, however, brought a harsher truth. Races were no longer about flow, but about violence, rear traction, and the brutal stop-start rhythm that demanded engines deliver torque like hammer blows. To be fast today, you have to use the rear to stop the bike, Jack Miller said with a smirk, each word echoing like a hammer striking an anvil. Quartararo sat later that evening staring at his telemetry sheet, and the voice in his head whispered, "All my lines are elegant, but elegance is punished now." That admission, even in silence, hurt more than any crash. Few mention the hidden number behind this transformation. Michelin's operating window requires peak rear carcass temperature of around 110 degrees Celsius, a threshold Yamaha's Inline-4 struggled to reach consistently without overloading. In mid-traction zones became unpredictable, a roulette wheel where rivals thrived while Yamaha bled confidence. In technical terms, the Inline-4's linear delivery had become a liability in an ecosystem demanding explosive bursts and tire management artistry. The contrast was merciless. Ducati and KTM extracted grip as if sculpting marble. Yamaha merely sketched shadows. The metaphor that haunts insiders is simple yet brutal. Yamaha tried to dance a waltz at a party where everyone else was playing jazz. Riders felt betrayed by their own heritage, forced to improvise styles their machine resisted. Mechanics watched tire were sheets like oracles, knowing fate was decided not by courage but by chemistry. Each lap unfolded like a negotiation with rubber that refused Yamaha's language. And in that refusal was humiliation, the sense that a giant had grown obsolete in its refusal to adapt. Journalists began to frame Yamaha's situation not as stubbornness but as denial, a company still convinced the world would bend back toward them. The races told another story, lap charts that began brightly but collapsed under acceleration duels. Miller's critique, so blunt it felt cruel, was also undeniable. Yamaha had resisted too long. The climax was not a crash or a lost title, but the realization that tradition had calcified into handicap. And when the checkered flags waved, Yamaha was not just behind. It was exposed, stripped bare in a world that had outgrown its poetry. The debut of Yamaha's V4 at Misano in 2025 was less a revelation than a trembling birth, a machine carried onto the circuit with the weight of 2 decades pressing against its fairing like invisible hands. Augusto Fernández, chosen as the first messenger of this new era, finished in the points, a modest achievement that looked fragile under the brutal glare of Ducati's dominance, but still felt like oxygen to a factory gasping for renewal. The symbolism of that Sunday could not erase the embarrassment of an electronic shortcut that blacked out the dashboard mid-race, forcing Fernández to ride blind with only lights flickering like cryptic signals from another world. We discovered it wasn't fuel but a faulty connection, clarified team boss Massimo Marigali, his tone mixing relief and shame, as if confessing both hope and fragility at once. In the stillness of his garage, Quartararo whispered inwardly, "If even the prototype hides in shadows, how long can I carry faith alone?" The voice quivered between defiance and exhaustion, a confession to himself more than to Yamaha. Behind the statistics lay a quiet miracle. In post-race testing, for the first time in years, all 4 riders, Quartararo, Rins, Miller, Oliveira, spoke with one voice, reporting the same sensations of braking stability, rear grip, and predictability. For engineers, that unity was more precious than a podium, because Yamaha's history had been plagued by fragmented feedback, pulling development in conflicting directions. Buried in telemetry was a technical curiosity. The V4's engine braking system employed a novel electronic exhaust valve sequence, allowing smoother deceleration patterns and preventing tire chatter that haunted the M1 in recent seasons. On the track, this subtle detail translated into Fernández carving tighter arcs through Misano's technical sectors, a glimpse of what could be. And yet the metaphor that hung in the air was hauntingly poetic. The V4 felt like a newborn bird, fragile wings flapping in a storm already filled with hawks. Yamaha's garage was alive with nervous electricity, mechanics crowding over laptops, riders replaying sensations with rare agreement, journalists circling like sharks smelling transformation. For once, Yamaha's narrative was not about nostalgia, but about possibility. Rossi himself wandered into the box, his presence both blessing and reminder, a ghost touching the cradle of a child that would never be his. The climax arrived not with results but with resonance, the realization that Yamaha had finally chosen to speak the language of the present. And in that choice, fragile though it seemed, there shimmered a sentence that might define the decade: rebirth is never loud, but it is always irreversible. When Valentino Rossi walked into Yamaha's Misano garage, time itself seemed to falter, as though the walls trembled under the weight of 2 epics colliding. He slid a leg over the new V4 prototype, and in that simple motion the past confronted the future with the intimacy of a whispered secret. Photographs flooded social media within minutes, showing the doctor perched on a machine that symbolized both rebirth and betrayal, and the world exhaled in collective nostalgia. "Living Yamaha legend meets the future," read the official caption, a phrase polished by marketing yet pierced with raw irony. For Rossi is no longer Yamaha's golden knight but the commander of Ducati's VR46 Armada, the man who now grows champions for the very factory that once stood as his bitter rival. Sitting silently on the machine, his inner thought might have been, "I made this house a temple once, but the altar now belongs to someone else." That reflection, imagined or real, is more haunting than any lap time. Insiders noted a subtle technical moment. Rossi adjusted his seating position instinctively and commented on a handlebar angle, an observation proving his racing instincts remained sharp even in retirement. Fans saw poetry. Engineers saw free consultancy wrapped in a legend's curiosity. The metaphor that rose from that instant was clear, like an old lighthouse shining briefly on a coastline that has already built new towers. The garage fell into reverent silence, as though Rossi's presence demanded confession from every mechanic who once served him. Quartararo watched the scene with clenched jaw, torn between admiration and unease, knowing the shadow of Rossi is both blessing and curse. Miller joked nervously about handing Rossi a transponder, but the laughter cracked under the gravity of the moment. Yamaha, desperate for symbolic validation, leaned heavily into the photo opportunity, but beneath the surface lay the question of sincerity. Was this a blessing or a farewell? The climax unfolded not in words but in atmosphere, a recognition that icons can bridge eras but cannot rewrite physics. For the V4 to succeed, Rossi's smile was not enough. Steel, electronics, and commitment would decide its destiny. Journalists described the encounter as theatrical, but those present felt something closer to liturgy, a ritual mixing memory and ambition. The paradox could not be sharper. The hero who once gambled his career to rescue Yamaha now feeds Ducati's empire. And so the snapshot became both treasure and wound, a relic of affection wrapped in irony. The day ended with a single sentence echoing across the paddock. Legends can bless the future, but they can never ride it again. The V4's unveiling did not deliver harmony, but exposed fractures, as if Yamaha's garage were a courtroom where each rider pled his own case before the jury of history. Fabio Quartararo, exhausted yet unbroken, emerged as the harshest critic, his verdict slicing through optimism like glass. The lack of top speed, the weak acceleration, the limitations in race trim remained, and for him that was unforgivable. If this bike doesn't take a real step, I can't stay here forever, he admitted with a candor that felt like a threat disguised as lament. Alone in the quiet of his hotel room that night, he thought, how long do you sacrifice your prime years for promises that dissolve like smoke? The words never spoken aloud became heavier than the results sheets pinned to the walls. Andrea Dovizioso, now in a role of sage test rider, saw the glass half full, telling Jorge Lorenzo privately that from the very first moment Yamaha had gained traction, a subtle miracle considering the inline four's chronic weakness. Lorenzo, the eternal perfectionist, echoed his optimism, calling the V4 debut promising, as though reassurance could be engineered into lap times. Buried inside the data was a technical secret worth noting. Telemetry revealed a reduction in rear-wheel spin variance of 7% compared to the M1, a sign of improved mechanical electronic harmony. Yet Alex Rins, who had the authority of having lived both Suzuki's inline-4 elegance and Honda's V4 brutality, offered balance, braking stability, corner entry, and front feel were encouraging, but the bike was still 3 to 4 kilometers per hour slower on the straights. That gap, cruel in its simplicity, was the difference between fighting for podiums and fighting for survival. The metaphor that rose from his analysis was sharp. Yamaha had built a staircase that reached halfway to the sky, but the final steps were missing and gravity was merciless. Jack Miller, ever the optimist, argued the fundamentals were correct, praising how the bike's interaction with the rear tire already mirrored the language of the Michelin era. In the pit lane, voices clashed like instruments out of tune, one melody insisting rebirth, another whispering decay. Engineers scribbled notes feverishly, knowing that unity among riders was fragile and rare, and this moment of divided truth could fracture the project's momentum. The paddock absorbed every word, amplifying each perspective into headlines that oscillated between prophecy and eulogy. What should have been Yamaha's clean rebirth became a mirror reflecting every doubt, every hope, every fracture of belief. The climax arrived in silence, in the realization that one star's skepticism outweighed 3 men's optimism. And so the V4's story at this stage was not written in speed but in uncertainty, with Quartararo's shadow looming over every lap. For Yamaha, the true test was no longer whether the bike could go faster, but whether it could keep the rider who alone kept their relevance alive. In that tension, sharper than any apex, lay the truth of Misano's aftermath. Machines can be improved, but trust, once lost, rarely returns. The V4 project now breathes like an unfinished sculpture. Its outlines clear, yet its essence still unformed, awaiting the chisels of Sepping and Valencia, where the next great truths will be carved. Yamaha insists officially that the inline-4 has not been condemned, that its curtain may fall in 2026 and not before, but the inevitability hangs over every press release like storm clouds over a fragile pier. We are evaluating step by step, one executive murmured, though his eyes betrayed the knowledge that hesitation is already defeat. Alone with his thoughts after Misano, Quartararo confessed inwardly, half a second. That is the distance between hope and despair, between staying and leaving. That metric, tiny yet infinite, has become the prison bars of Yamaha's future. Engineers whisper obsessively about extracting that missing half-second per lap, measuring in telemetry traces what feels like destiny itself. Hidden in the numbers lies a technical clue. Simulations show that if Yamaha unlocks an additional 10 horsepower without sacrificing rear grip, the deficit could collapse overnight, a possibility both tantalizing and cruel. Yet, this is not only an engineering battle but a human one, for Quartararo has made it clear he will not gamble his prime years on a promise written only in blue paint. The metaphor takes shape vividly. Yamaha is like a pianist at a grand concert, fingers hovering over the keys, knowing the next chord will decide whether the hall erupts in applause or silence. If they lose Quartararo, they must lure another star, but such riders are rare meteors, not commodities. Sepang will be a laboratory of truth, Valencia a tribunal, and the postseason a crucible where faith is either reforged or shattered. Miller, Oliveira, and Rins may provide data, but it is Quartararo's signature that will determine the company's fate, binding future to flesh. Journalists frame the crossroads with brutal clarity, cling to the past, and Yamaha risks becoming a relic admired more for memory than relevance. Reinvent itself, and the price will be immense, financial and emotional. Fans feel the tremor too, oscillating between devotion and doubt, watching every update as if salvation could be announced in a press briefing. The climax builds not from speed but from suspense, a question that grows heavier with each lap unturned. Yamaha's soul is on trial, its heritage in conflict with necessity, its glory begging for renewal. And so the stakes are not merely technical but existential. MotoGP has offered Yamaha one last coin to gamble, and the table is unforgiving. The story narrows to a single sentence that feels carved in fire. Half a second will decide if Yamaha belongs to tomorrow or to yesterday.